Hi, my name is Johnny Gartner, and thank you so much for joining me for this week's episode of the Cedar 60 podcast. Today, we'll be dealing with a very sensitive topic of domestic violence and sexual assault, and as such, today's episode may not be appropriate for all audiences. We encourage you to pray before listening and prepare your heart for this topic. Talk with me about these issues is Ms. Shannon Berkheiser and Mr. John Davis. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Johnny. Thanks for asking us.
Yeah,
thank you for having us.
Of course. So if you could first introduce yourselves, talk a little bit about what you do on campus, and then we'll kind of get into the details of what this episode entails.
My name is Shannon Berkheiser, and I'm the Title IX coordinator, and I'm in my second year in that role here at Cedarville. Prior to coming here to Cedarville, I lived in New York State, and I worked at a victim service agency there, and I filled several roles. I was a counselor, I was a victim advocate, and most recently, before coming to Cedarville, I was our county's sexual assault response team coordinator. So I overlapped a lot with law enforcement and the judicial system, medical systems, coming alongside people who had experienced sexual assault. I also spent 5 years working in higher ed at a Bible college in New York State in their counseling department and overseeing student internships.
Yeah, and it's been my joy to have been here at Cedarville for about 20 years now. Right now, I currently serve as a team lead for human resources, and our primary objectives are the caring and calling of employees. So caring, taking care of their needs, whatever those may be, everything from salary to benefits to anything in between. And then calling is really just our recruitment efforts and letting people know what it is that we do at Cedarville and how they can utilize their God-given talents here at the university.
This topic is obviously a pretty sensitive one, so I want to be careful as we go through this episode about making sure that we address this thing in a way that glorifies God and respects people who may be listening, who may have experienced a situation that relates to the topic we'll be discussing. And I want to ask you maybe a little bit later what some resources for people who may be in that situation are. But before we get there, we do talk about politics on this show and how it relates to our role as Christians in this world. And Congress recently passed a new law. It's called H.R. 4445, ending forced arbitration of sexual assault and sexual harassment. So I think I want to begin there and talk a little bit about how that relates to kind of the standing laws that we have in this country in higher education, but also in the workplace dealing with sexual assault, and sexual harassment. So if we could start there, maybe just as a general overview of what the law is and maybe some of the standing laws are, that would be great.
Yeah, so that was a long HR 4445. That's very typical government
Yes,
stuff, right? At the end of the day, what it was is a very quick adjustment to language that basically said forced arbitration is out. Federal courts are now back in when it comes to the topics of sexual harassment and sexual assault claims. So if there is a federal jurisdiction or federal law related to sexual assault or sexual harassment claims, so whether it be in the Title IX space, in the Title VII space, that language of forced arbitration can no longer be enforced. So what do we mean by arbitration? What do we mean by forced arbitration? Arbitration at its very core, at its very basic, is just an alternative private form of resolving disputes where both parties would agree to have a disinterested third party hear their case and then determine an outcome. But it's separate from our judicial system. So we typically would hear of this in perhaps union cases. Probably most likely you might hear of this in sports, the sports arena. Oh, that went to arbitration. You might hear that. At a very basic level, I like going to my local coffee shop, and I use my Apple Watch and my Apple Pay to pay for my coffee. When I looked up the terms and agreements for using Apple Pay, you know what I found? If I have a claim against Apple Pay because they charged me $4.99 instead of the $3.99 I should have been paying for my drink, I have to go into forced arbitration. So by my agreeing to those terms and agreements with Apple Pay, I'm forced into a forced arbitration if I have a claim against Apple for doing something wrong. Now, we're talking about a much more serious issue today about sexual assault and sexual harassment claims. And there are places and spaces where that forced arbitration type language is in play. And so basically what the federal government has said is those no longer can stick. Those are no longer in play. Someone has the right to go into the judicial system and say, I want my case heard before a judiciary. I don't want to be pushed into a forced arbitration space if I have a sexual assault or a sexual harassment claim.
So this bill received some pretty bipartisan support. It passed Congress pretty quickly. It was signed by the president shortly thereafter. So it seems like it's generally a good move in the right direction. But if we could talk next a little bit about what Title IX is in terms of how it addresses sexual assault and sexual violence on educational institutions, as well as the role of Title VII in corporate or workplace settings.
Mm-hmm. Title IX has been around for a long time. It's a federal regulation that was put into play in 1972. And the idea with Title IX is that it prohibits educational institutions that receive federal funding from discriminating on the basis of gender. And so years ago in the 70s when it was first instituted, I think most people picture sports in relation to Title IX, that universities need to make sure that they're equitable in the opportunities that they offer to men and women. It's really transitioned since then. Sex discrimination, gender discrimination is still at its heart, but throughout the 80s and 90s and now into the 2000s, the federal government has really expanded their definition of what comes under that umbrella term of sex discrimination. And so most recently, under the previous administration, the Office of Civil Rights expanded that to include sexual harassment, any kind of sexual violence, stalking, and domestic and dating violence. So they've really broadened that out, that the expectation is that universities such as Cedarville is actively seeking to address and to remedy any types of sex discrimination.
So Cedarville has a campaign called Speak Up Cedarville that's organized through your office, the Title IX office on campus. Could you talk a little bit about what they do to kind of address some of those things that you were just talking about?
Yeah, so we started our Speak Up Cedarville campaign last year, and it's a campus-wide campaign. We really want our students and our staff to know that these issues are something that our entire university system wants to embrace. Everyone that's a part of Cedarville is a child of God, and their value, their sexual dignity is very important to our Lord and to our Savior. And so as image bearers, we want to make sure that we're reflecting God's justice, God's mercy, His compassion, the value that he has for his children. So that's a lot of the educational piece of Title IX. We want to actively be teaching each student and employee that we have a responsibility to bear God's image well. And if in each moment I remember that I'm bearing God's image to you, that will radically change the way that I treat you. And if you are recognizing your responsibility to bear God's image to me will change the way you treat me. So that's that preventative side, the educational side of Title IX, of really wanting to change the way that we seek to value and honor people, especially when it comes to sexual assault, sexual harassment. The other side of Title IX is more of the response side. Now that something has happened or is alleged to be happened, how do we remedy this for this individual? And our focus in our Title IX department here at Cedarville, we want our focus to be on image bearing. We want it to be on honoring our government. But within that process, we really want it to be a place that's safe for them, a place where they're valued and respected. It needs to be a place of due process where we follow government policies, where we follow our own policies, and we seek to communicate with both parties that they're valued and that we seek to walk alongside both of them well. There's a lot for students and employees who engage with my office to navigate. And one of my main roles, besides being in compliance, is helping them navigate that system to the best that they can.
Yeah. There's a lot of really great things to unpack there. I think obviously as a Christian institution, Cedarville's, as you mentioned, called to a higher standard than just to comply with the law, but to care for people, like you said, as the image bearers they are. And obviously Cedarville is primarily an academic institution, but it also employs a lot of people. So if you could kind of touch on, similarly to what she was talking about, how these kinds of laws affect Cedarville as an employment institution as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Shannon, I couldn't help but think of Micah 6:8. He talked about doing justice, loving mercy, walking humbly with the Lord. That's a great place to start when we think about how do we engage with one another when there is brokenness in our world. And in an employment setting, there will be broken relationships. Vast majority don't deal with sexual harassment or sexual assault claims, but that's part of the brokenness in the world in which we live. And so for Shannon and I, in our roles really are what's known as creatures of statute, meaning that the work I do really falls out of the expectations of Title VII federal law that says this is how we in the United States at a federal level expect you to engage with your employees. And so Title VII speaks to discrimination based on age, race, disability, religion, national origin, and even sex, right? And so from my seat and where I sit, I'm thinking from that perspective, right, with biblical lens, gospel-focused lens, how do we care well for our people? And on our team, when we talk about caring well for people, it means that people understand the expectations, they understand the road ahead, they understand the choices they have, and then they can engage and make good, reasoned decisions about where they want to be in the future. And so as we engage in this space, and then there are moments where Shannon and I have to work together collaboratively because sexual assault and sexual harassment claims do arise. And so it's been a privilege and a joy to walk alongside of Shannon as her team initiates and walks through that with someone where it is a very challenging and difficult space. And then once they've walked through that, then it may become the responsibility of our team to begin to walk that road with somebody in the employment space.
So obviously no law is perfect, and there are downsides to every law that passed. And obviously these laws have provided significant guidelines for how to act and have helped, make a standard for people to be able to approach these issues. So if you could talk maybe about, historically speaking, what the good parts about these laws are that help make your job easier, but also maybe, what some of the conflicting areas that create some of these problems that we hear about in some other academic institutions, and certainly Cedarville is not immune to those in the future.
Mm-hmm. The positive side of a federal regulation such as Title IX is that it does provide this objective standard that we need to meet. It provides a lot of accountability because as an institution that there's this external piece that is assessing the work that you do. And I think that's valuable. It can create a challenge when the people who institute the guidance and the laws may have a different worldview. Underneath the Obama administration, there was a number of different pieces of guidance that were put out that didn't carry the weight of law, but as guidance comes out, then as a university, you have to shift to match that. Under our last administration, under the Trump administration, things shifted much more because it wasn't just guidance that was put out, it was then put out as the force of law. This is now the way you have to do it. And one of the last things that happened under the Trump administration is it created a lot more overlap for John and I. Prior, Title IX focused much more on the student of the university. Now, Title IX, it's been very much expanded to any person who's considered to be a part of the university community. And so employees, rather than just seeking a grievance process through HR, the way they would have 2 or 3 years ago if there was sexual assault or sexual harassment claims, now that has to also run through Title IX.
I think we see a law like the one that just passed and we think something big has changed. Is the process fundamentally changed And how does this law specifically affect places like Cedarville, Christian institutions? Is it something that we should be concerned about? Is it something we should applaud? Or is it kind of just a step in the right direction that will not significantly impact how these situations are investigated and arbitrated?
Yeah, that's a great question. So specifically to HR 4445, a lot of fours in there. I think it's more of a clarification, though I think attorneys will argue that it's a significant shift because of just the things around it that would say now we're taking it out of this forced arbitration space and now it's moving into the judicial system. But from my standpoint, in the seat I'm sitting in, I would say it's more of a clarification. It's basically saying to me, in my oversight and role of what we do in regards to the regulatory jurisdiction of Title VII, that forced arbitration language is out. You can't be using it. You shouldn't be using it. That's a clarification for me as a practitioner in the process of making sure that our employees understand what's available to them, what's not. So in this case, in the HR 4445, employees have access where there is federal jurisdiction to have access to the judiciary.
So I will be graduating from Cedarville in a year and a half, and I'll go out into a workplace. And how do I think about these laws, these practices in a way that can make me a better coworker, a better employee, a better friend, and how can other people who are graduating from Cedarville, who are maybe already out in the workplace, think about these things to help them better reflect the gospel?
I think about how our heart is desperately wicked, right? And so we know as followers of Christ that the antidote to that, the thing that we recognize is the hope of the gospel. So it doesn't matter where you step into an environment with employment, recognize that the heart is desperately wicked. So you're going to see things that may be shocking to you. Yeah. You're going to engage in conversations. You're like, ooh, but recognize what Scripture says and recognize that the response to that is the hope of the gospel. So as we leave Cedarville as a student and we might enter into the marketplace, recognize that that is what we are called to do. We are to reflect the Lord in that space in which we enter into. And as a response to that, there's no law that can cover every desperately wicked thing my heart wants to do. Yeah. At best, laws can try to push off, stave off, try to address, but it's a constant moving thing. And we know that the only constant thing is the hope of the gospel. And so keep that in mind as you enter into wherever God may take you. And that will help you as you work through some really challenging and even maybe perhaps hard things.
Mm-hmm. We want to recognize for each student and each staff member here that we each have a flock. And by a flock, I mean a group of people that we will have influence with or authority over. And as part of reflecting God's image is recognizing the authority and the influence that I have, the weight that carries. We remember, how does Christ use the immense authority and power that he has? And over again, he seeks to use that to glorify his Father, and then he seeks to use that for our benefit. He didn't use it for himself. And so as image bearers, when we have positions of power and influence and authority, that we seek to use that to honor our Father and to seek the well-being of the people that we have that control and authority over.
I think I've already had some experience in a workplace seeing some, inappropriate conduct, and it wasn't physical, it was verbal. And so what advice do you have for people who are in the workplace or see misconduct? And it's really difficult, especially if the person's in authority over you, to have a conversation like that. So what advice do you have with, entering into conversations like that, or if you have been a victim of something like that, with, having the boldness and the confidence to start conversations like that in the workplace or at a place like Cedarville?
Yeah, I would say, I would say you start with prayer. You go to the Lord and say, Lord, this is how I heard it. This is what I'm feeling in the moment. Lord, help me understand whether I'm hearing rightly what I just engaged with. And then, Lord, give me the boldness to know the right way to engage with this individual, supervisor or otherwise, so that, Lord, you're glorified through the actions I take, and that I'm not just reacting in the moment in ways that may not be glorifying to the Lord. Because that's my heart. My heart is like, I want to fight back, right? There's something in there that I just want to but taking that moment to go before the Lord and say, Lord, this is my heart right now. I need to get it right with you first. And then have that boldness. Now, there may be some scenarios where that's inappropriate for you to be that, and you need an advocate. You need someone else. You need to go to another authority, depending on what that is. And in those moments, you rightly should do that. But if it's in a scenario like you just said, let's say it's just verbal words that aren't of a sexual nature or whatever, but it's just maybe terse, blunt words and ways that landed with you, then I think it's appropriate for you to go before the Lord and say, Lord, help me to understand how to, and figure out what it is the heart from that person that's pushing this towards you, and that will give you entrance, hopefully, into a good dialogue with that individual.
Yeah, and I think on a practical level as well, if someone has experienced something that they believe is harassing in nature, that they document the experience that they're having, the dates and the times, the individuals involved, and what was said, to create documentation for it. I think that it's important, especially early on, and I know this can be so very challenging because if it's someone who has authority over us, we get concerned what will be the ramifications. But I do think that often we don't take that first step of clearly communicating that this is unwelcome behavior. And for some people, it may not be unwelcome. And so if we don't let them know that it's unwelcome, then they are encouraged to continue. So I think that it's worth that try to say, what you just said was inappropriate, and I can't tolerate that. Please do not do this again. And then if it continues, practically speaking, then you need to move on to engage with someone else. It might be that you need to engage with that person's supervisor. For any employee, I would really encourage them to engage with their human resource department. That's one of the roles that they fill. And so create documentation, set a clear boundary in the hopes that it will nip it early on. But if it continues, then to engage the support systems that their workplace has.
So we've talked about a lot of really great things here. We've talked about the resources available, but if you could quickly just, if someone's listening and they are the victim of unwanted comments or physical assault, what resources available to them, just as a general option to talk to somebody and to get help?
So here at the university, for employees, they could seek my office out directly, or they could start with HR. And for students, they could engage with our campus counseling center if they want a confidential time to speak. They could engage with our university medical services individuals. They could engage with their Res Life staff. They can engage directly with my department through email or through phone. Off campus, locally, we have some great resources. We have the Greene County Family Violence Prevention Center, and they are a local resource that has a variety of services to support people who've been the victims of crime, primarily dating and domestic violence, stalking, and sexual assault and sexual abuse. And we also have a victim witness division with the Greene County Prosecutor's Office. And Cedarville's, through our Title IX department, we've been really engaging with them and using them as a resource, creating a lot of relationships there. And so they're a great resource, and both offer services to students free of charge and come alongside them.
Yeah, and I would only add to that, and that's an amazing list, is outside of this setting in education, if you find yourself going into an employment setting, make sure you know up front what are those avenues before you ever enter into a challenging space. That way you just know. And if there are immediate issues, call the police. Just call the police and then just work through it at that point. And then, finally, just be prepared for the reality that you're probably going to have to do something challenging if that occurs. And recognize that you do what's right before the Lord first, and then let everything work itself out. The Lord will work through that. My first thought should not be, what's going to happen to me? My first thought ought to be, what's the right thing to do before the Lord in this situation? The Lord will provide.
If you could just provide, how do we come alongside people who may have been victims or, in order to prevent these sort of things? And maybe if you have examples in your own lives, you could share, without explicit details.
Okay. So I think that one of the main ways we come alongside someone well is listening, providing a safe place through listening, no judgment, no victim blaming, and then seeing what are the practical needs that I can assist with. And then what are the resources, because it shouldn't be one person's burden to try to help solve this issue for their friend or their loved one. Just playing that one role in that moment and then seeing who else does that person need, and getting their permission before engaging anyone else, respecting their privacy.
One of the greatest gifts that God's given us is the church, the local body, and one of the reasons he's done that is because we need to be known. And we're all creatures of habit, and we're all creatures of rhythm. And when I notice my brother and my sister out of that rhythm or that creature of habit, there's something there that I need to probably press in a little bit and say, hey, I'm noticing something seems off, or what's going on, you all right? And in that way, I'm able to then, as Shannon has just articulated so well, be that place. And if you're asking for a specific example, the best specific example I can give to you is when people do that, when they pay attention to what's happening around them and they pay attention to the people in their space and recognize when something seems off, that's that moment that the Lord will use to help them with whatever may come.
You guys have provided some really practical ways to humbly address these issues, not only as a campus community, but as the church. And so I really appreciate both of you coming on. We like giving our guests the last 60 seconds to share whatever's on their heart. If there was something you didn't get to say, now's the chance. So you each have 60 seconds if you'd like to close.
Well, I appreciate the time to participate in this conversation today. And I would just like to encourage, if there's any students or employees of Cedarville that feel that they've experienced something that deals with sexual harassment or relationship violence or sexual assault, that they know that we care, and that as a university and as individuals within that university, we care about their experience, and we want to be as supportive as possible and help meet the needs that they have. For maybe the bigger audience that's listening to this, maybe Cedarville isn't your space, but whatever space that you're in, there is a resource. So we'd really encourage you to seek that resource out. It may be within your local church. It may be within your community or someone within your family. Maybe it's an old prof from days gone by, but to reach out to someone because they're heavy burdens to carry, and God designed us to carry those with each other. So there will be somebody who will walk alongside them.
Johnny, I just want to say thank you for bringing the gospel to bear in a place like this and in a format like this. We do live in a space where there is great competition for our eyes and our ears. And you know what? This is important. We don't need to be distracted by everybody else's garbage. What matters is the gospel and the gospel of hope that we have in a really dark world. And so thank you. Thanks for bringing that to bear this morning, even in this conversation.
Yeah, well, thank you so much to both of you for joining us today. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Cedarville does have a Title IX page with some training resources and some resources to help people more aware when they're interacting with people. So we encourage students, faculty, even people not affiliated with the university to go to cedarville.edu and search Title IX for those resources. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of the Cedar 60 podcast. We hope you'll join us next time. Don't forget to share and like on social media and follow us on all major platforms. And we hope you'll join us next time. Thank you so much.